Hello friends, sometimes, you don't see the cracks until the whole foundation begins to crumble. Maybe it's because you're too close, too invested in the life you've built to notice the small shifts, the moments that should make you pause, but instead, you brush aside because you trust the person beside you. I used to believe that trust was unbreakable. I learned the hard way that it isn't. Her name is Emily. We've been married for 8 years, together for 10. At first, everything between us felt effortless, the kind of connection you read about in books or see in movies. She had this way of making the world seem brighter, as if nothing could touch us as long as we were together. We built a life filled with laughter, shared dreams, and late-night conversations that stretched until dawn. I thought we had something solid. Something real, but love has a way of masking the things you don't want to see. The first signs were easy to dismiss: a missed call she never mentioned, a smile at her phone that didn't quite match the messages she showed me, nights when she stayed out later than usual with friends I'd never met. I told myself it was nothing. After all, everyone needs space. You can't spend every moment together without suffocating each other. That's what I told myself, even as a knot of doubt began to form in my chest. The shift in her behavior was subtle at first. She started spending more time on her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a focus that seemed to shut out the world around her. When I asked who she was texting, she'd laugh it off: just a friend from work, nothing to worry about. But there was something in the way she said it, a flicker of something just beneath the surface that I couldn't quite place. Then came the late nights. Emily worked in marketing, and her job sometimes required long hours and networking events. I never questioned it, not at first. But the late nights became more frequent, the excuses more vague. Meetings that ran late, last-minute dinners with colleagues, errands that somehow stretched well past midnight. Each time, she had a perfectly reasonable explanation, and each time, I wanted to believe her. But belief has its limits, and mine were beginning to fray. The distance between us grew in ways I couldn't ignore. Conversations that once flowed freely now felt strained, as if we were speaking across a chasm and neither of us knew how to bridge. She seemed distracted, her laughter no longer reaching her eyes. Our moments of intimacy became fewer and further between, replaced by a silence that settled heavy between us. I told myself it was just a rough patch, something every couple goes through. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The first undeniable red flag came on a Friday night. Emily had told me she was meeting colleagues for drinks after work, something she'd done plenty of times before. I spent the evening at home, trying to ignore the nagging sense that something wasn't right. When midnight came and went with no word from her, that feeling only grew stronger. I called her, but the call went to voicemail after a few rings. I sent a text, asking if everything was okay. No reply. By the time the clock hit 2 a.m., my mind was racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. When she finally walked through the door at 2:30, her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly tousled as if she'd been in a hurry. She offered a quick explanation, something about losing track of time and her phone battery dying. I wanted to believe her, so I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. But the unease didn't leave me. If anything, it burrowed deeper, settling in the space between us as we climbed into bed in silence. In the days that followed, I found myself watching her more closely. There were moments when I caught her glancing at her phone with a faint smile she quickly tried to hide, moments when she seemed to pull away from my touch as if the space between us had become too vast to bridge. Each moment added another thread to the web of doubt that had begun to take shape in my mind. Then, one evening, I found myself alone in the living room while Emily took a shower upstairs. Her phone sat on the coffee table, screen dark and silent. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, torn between the need to know and the fear of what I might find. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for it, my fingers hovering over the screen. I knew I shouldn't look. Trust is supposed to be the foundation of a marriage. But trust had already begun to crack, and I needed answers. I unlocked the phone with a code I hadn't realized I knew until that moment. The screen lit up, and my eyes scanned the messages with a mixture of dread and determination. Most were harmless conversations with friends, work-related texts, reminders and to-do lists. But then I saw the name. Ryan. The messages were short, but the undertones were unmistakable. Late-night exchanges filled with inside jokes and playful teasing, casual mentions of meetings that hadn't made their way into our conversations. My stomach twisted as I scrolled further, each message another drop of poison sinking into my veins. But it was the last message that hit hardest. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Same place? My breath caught in my throat as the words stared back at me, stark against the glow of the screen. There was no room for misinterpretation, no way to twist the meaning into something innocent. The knot of unease that had taken root in my chest now pulled tight, a weight that seemed to crush the air from my lungs. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, each one echoing through the house with a heavy finality. I set the phone down just as Emily entered the room, her hair damp from the shower, eyes widening slightly as she saw me standing there. For a moment, the air between us seemed to freeze, heavy with the unspoken truth that hung between us that I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The look in my eyes must have said it all because she paused mid-step, her smile faltering as if she could feel the shift in the air. And in that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The hours after that moment passed in a blur. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts I couldn't untangle, my chest heavy with the weight of what I'd seen. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the messages, each word etched into my memory like a scar that wouldn't fade. The playful teasing, the inside jokes, the casual familiarity that spoke of something far deeper than friendship. And that final message, the one that had shattered any lingering hope that I'd misunderstood, echoed in my mind with relentless clarity. Can't wait to see you again tomorrow. Same place? Sleep was impossible. I lay awake in the darkness, listening to the faint sounds of Emily breathing beside me, her presence both familiar and foreign in a way I couldn't explain. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had built my life with, had become a stranger overnight. Every touch, every glance, every whispered promise now felt like part of a carefully constructed lie. My thoughts circled endlessly, chasing questions that had no answers. How long had it been going on? Had it started with a chance encounter, or had it been deliberate from the start? Each possibility twisted like a knife in my chest, sharp and unrelenting. The next morning, I moved through the motions of daily life with a sense of numb detachment. Emily acted as if nothing had changed, her smile as bright as ever, her laughter ringing through the house as if the walls weren't closing in around us. I watched her closely, searching for signs I hadn't noticed before: the lingering glances at her phone, the faint flush that rose to her cheeks when she thought I wasn't looking. Every detail added another thread to the web of suspicion tightening around me, but I said nothing. Not yet. I needed more than a few text messages. I needed the truth, the full, undeniable truth that would leave no room for doubt. So I waited. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. I paid closer attention to her schedule, noting the nights she stayed out late and the vague explanations she offered when she returned. Work dinners, networking events, drinks with friends, each excuse sounded plausible on its own, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Her phone became a constant source of tension, its screen lighting up with messages she never shared, its buzz echoing in the silence of the house like a reminder of the distance growing between us. One evening, while Emily was upstairs, I found myself standing in the kitchen, her phone resting on the counter beside me. The temptation was undeniable, the need to know stronger than any fear of what I might find. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the screen lighting up with a notification that made my heart clench. Ryan, see you tomorrow. Can't wait. My breath caught in my throat as I unlocked the phone, scrolling through the messages with a mixture of dread and determination. The conversations were more frequent now, each exchange laced with a familiarity that left no room for doubt. Mentions of secret meetings, shared moments that hadn't made their way into our conversations. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrolled further, each message another blow to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong. But there was no mistaking the meaning behind their words. Last time was incredible. I haven't stopped thinking about it. Wish I could see you tonight. Counting the hours until tomorrow. The air seemed to thicken around me, pressing against my chest as if the walls themselves were closing in. My hands shook as I set the phone down, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. How long had it been going on? How many nights had she spent with him while I waited at home, unaware of the lies woven into the fabric of our life together? The images that filled my mind were impossible to push aside: their laughter, their stolen moments, the intimacy they shared while I was left in the dark. Footsteps sounded overhead, faint but unmistakable. Emily was moving through the house, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood frozen in place, the weight of what I had discovered pressing down on me like a physical force. For a moment, I considered confronting her right then and there, demanding the truth, forcing her to admit what she had done. But the words wouldn't come. The shock was too fresh, the betrayal too raw to give voice to the questions that burned in my chest. Instead, I left the phone where I had found it and stepped outside, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat of anger and sorrow that burned beneath my skin. The distant hum of traffic and the faint rustle of leaves did little to quiet the storm raging within me. My thoughts chased themselves in endless circles, each one leading back to the same conclusion: the woman I had trusted with my heart had chosen someone else. And no matter how much I wanted to understand why, the answers wouldn't change the reality of what had happened. Hours passed as I paced the backyard, the distant lights of neighboring houses flickering against the dark sky. The ache in my chest grew heavier with each step, but beneath the sorrow, a sense of clarity began to take shape. There was no undoing what had been done, no erasing the words I had read or the images they had conjured. The trust that had once bound us together had been shattered beyond repair, leaving behind only the question of what came next. When I finally returned inside, the house felt colder than before, the walls seeming to echo with the weight of unspoken truths. Emily was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady in the stillness of the bedroom. I stood in the doorway, watching her with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. How had we come to this? How had the love we had built together unraveled into secrets and lies? The answers wouldn't come, no matter how long I stood there searching for them. As I lay in the darkness, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock the only sounds in the stillness, one thought echoed through my mind with relentless clarity: nothing will ever be the same again. The morning after I read the messages, the house felt different. The walls seemed to press closer, heavy with the weight of what I now knew. Every sound: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet seemed louder, sharper, as if the air itself carried the tension that had settled into my chest. I moved through the routine of breakfast and coffee with a sense of detachment, my mind still caught in the loop of images and words that had played through my thoughts all night. Emily moved around the kitchen with the same practiced ease as always, her smile bright, her laughter light, as if nothing had changed. But I could see the cracks beneath the surface: the way her gaze flicked toward her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the faint tension that lingered in her shoulders when she passed too close. Maybe she could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken knowledge that hung between us like a storm waiting to break. My hands tightened around the coffee mug as I watched her, the questions burning in my mind with a force I could no longer contain. How long had it been going on? How many nights had she spent with him while I waited at home, unaware of the lies woven into the fabric of our life together? Each thought twisted deeper into my chest, sharp and relentless, until the need for answers became too heavy to ignore. I waited until she left for work, the sound of the front door closing behind her echoing through the silence of the house. As soon as she was gone, I moved through the rooms with a restless energy, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. Every corner seemed to hold a memory that clashed against the reality of what I had discovered: the laughter we had shared in the kitchen, the late-night conversations in the living room, the quiet intimacy of mornings spent wrapped in each other's arms. But those memories felt distant now, overlaid with the image of her messages, the words she had shared with another man in the moments when I thought we were still whole. By the time evening arrived, the tension inside me had reached a breaking point. I couldn't pretend any longer, couldn't carry the weight of what I knew without demanding the truth. The sound of Emily's car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins, my pulse pounding in my ears as I waited for the front door to open. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last, until the door swung open and she stepped inside, her gaze meeting mine with a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. The air between us seemed to freeze, thick with the weight of unspoken words. She paused, keys still in hand, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The smile that had been on her lips faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty that passed through her eyes before she masked it with practiced ease. But it was too late. I had seen the hesitation, the faint tremor that betrayed the facade she wore so carefully that I stood in the center of the living room, my hands clenched into fists at my sides as the words gathered in my throat, heavy and unyielding. The silence stretched between us, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. I could feel the pulse of my heartbeat against my ribs, each beat a countdown to the moment when everything would change. The confrontation began without words. It was in the way our eyes met, the silent exchange of knowledge that neither of us could deny. I could see the flicker of recognition in her gaze, the moment she realized that the secrets she had guarded so carefully had been laid bare. Her posture shifted, shoulders drawing back as if preparing for a blow she knew was coming. That I took a step forward, the distance between us shrinking with each heartbeat. The air felt electric, charged with the tension of everything we had left unsaid. My breath came shallow and fast, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I searched her eyes for answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. But the need to know, to understand the choices she had made, drove me forward, pulling the words from my chest with a force I couldn't resist. She stood her ground, her gaze steady but guarded, as if weighing how much of the truth she was willing to reveal. The air around us seemed to pulse with the weight of our shared history, the love that had once bound us together, now fractured beneath the strain of betrayal. Every memory we had built together now felt like a lie, each moment tainted by the knowledge of what she had done. That I could see the flicker of defiance in her eyes, the instinct to defend herself, to twist the narrative into something she could justify. But beneath that, I saw something else, something raw and unfiltered that she couldn't hide, no matter how hard she tried. Guilt. The weight of it clung to her like a shadow, visible in the way her hands clenched at her sides, in the tight line of her jaw as she braced herself against the fallout of her choices. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with the tension of everything we had left unsaid. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat echoing the unspoken question that hung between us. Why? But no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until it became clear that no answer would be enough to fill the space that had grown between us. Whatever explanations she might offer, whatever justifications she might give, none of it could erase the reality of what had happened. The trust that had once bound us together had been shattered, and no amount of words could piece it back together. In that moment, the weight of the truth settled fully into my chest, cold and unyielding. There was no going back, no way to undo what had been done. The life we had built together, the future we had imagined, had crumbled beneath the weight of her choices. And as much as I wanted to understand why, I knew that the answers wouldn't change the outcome. The air between us seemed to shift, the tension giving way to a heavy finality that settled into the space where hope had once lived. I stepped back, the distance between us widening with each breath as the realization settled into my bones. This was the end, and as I turned away, the silence of the house seemed to echo with the finality of that choice, a silence that would linger long after the door had closed behind me. The hours after the confrontation passed in a haze, each moment stretched thin with the weight of what had been said and the countless words that had been left unspoken. My mind felt like a battlefield, torn between the anger that burned hot beneath my skin and the sorrow that settled deep in my chest, heavy and unyielding. Every breath seemed to echo with the realization that the life I had built, the future I had envisioned, had crumbled beneath the weight of her choices. Sleep remained elusive. Each time I closed my eyes, the memories replayed with relentless clarity, the late-night messages, the stolen glances at her phone, the unmistakable warmth in her smile when she thought of him. I saw their laughter in places I would never know, their shared moments unfolding like scenes from a life that didn't include me. The words she hadn't spoken echoed louder than those she had, each silence another layer of the distance that now separated us. Morning arrived with a pale, gray light that filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The air felt heavy, thick with the remnants of everything we hadn't said the night before. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor with a hollow ache in my chest, the weight of exhaustion pressing against my shoulders. Somewhere down the hall, I heard the faint sounds of Emily moving through the house, the soft creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the coffee maker. The familiarity of those sounds felt like a mockery of the life we had shared, a reminder of how quickly the foundation beneath us had cracked. The kitchen felt colder than usual when I entered, the air thick with the unspoken tension that hung between us. Emily stood by the stove, her back to me as she stirred her coffee with slow, deliberate motions. The faint clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug echoed louder than it should have, each sound punctuating the silence that had settled between us. She didn't turn around when I entered, and for a moment, I wondered if she could feel the weight of my gaze on her shoulders, the questions I couldn't bring myself to ask still burning in the air between us. The coffee tasted bitter, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my chest. Each sip felt heavier than the last, as if the act of swallowing carried with it the weight of everything I couldn't say. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with each passing second, pressing against my ribs until I could barely breathe beneath the weight of it. Time moved slowly in the days that followed, each moment stretching into the next with a relentless sense of inevitability. Emily and I existed in the same space but moved through it like strangers, our words reduced to the bare necessities of daily life. The distance between us felt insurmountable, a chasm carved by the choices she had made and the trust that had been broken beyond repair. Each glance, each accidental brush of hands, carried the echo of what had been lost, the warmth that had once bound us together now replaced by a silence that seemed to stretch on without end. That I found myself replaying the memories of our life together, searching for the moment when everything had begun to shift. The late-night conversations that had once brought us closer now felt like whispers from another world, their echoes fading beneath the weight of what had been revealed. I remembered the laughter we had shared, the dreams we had woven together, each thread now frayed beyond recognition. Yet, no matter how far back I looked, I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the distance between us had begun to grow. Maybe it had happened gradually, the cracks forming beneath the surface until they became too deep to ignore. Or maybe it had been there all along, hidden beneath the facade of a life that had never been as solid as I had believed. The world outside moved on without me, its rhythms continuing unchanged as my own seemed to slow to a crawl. Work became both a refuge and a reminder of what I had lost, a space where the weight of betrayal could be set aside, if only for a few hours, yet one that echoed with the absence of the life I had once returned home to. Friends and colleagues noticed the shift in my demeanor, the hollow exhaustion that lingered behind my eyes, the way my laughter no longer seemed to reach as far as it once had. But their questions remained unspoken, the unspoken understanding that some wounds were too raw to be touched. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house seemed to press against my chest with a weight that grew heavier with each passing hour. I lay awake in the darkness, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the clock the only sounds that broke the stillness. Sleep, when it came, was restless and fragmented, haunted by dreams that carried the echoes of her laughter and the shadows of the life we had lost. Each morning, I woke with the same hollow ache in my chest, the weight of betrayal settling into my bones like a burden I couldn't set down, and yet, beneath the sorrow and the anger, a question lingered, a question that echoed through my thoughts with a relentless persistence. What comes next? The future that had once stretched before me, clear and certain, now felt like an expanse of unknowns. The life I had built with Emily had been woven from dreams that no longer seemed to fit the shape of who we had become. But as much as the thought of moving forward alone filled me with uncertainty, the alternative to remain trapped in the shadow of her choice felt even more impossible. The decision weighed heavy on my mind, each thought a step toward the moment when I would have to choose between holding on to the fragments of what had been and letting go in search of what could still be. The past clung to me like a shadow, its echoes woven into every memory that passed through my mind. But with each day that passed, the weight of that shadow began to feel a little less suffocating, as if the first hints of dawn were beginning to break through the darkness. As I stood in the doorway of the guest room one evening, the faint glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls, I realized that the choice I faced was not one of blame or forgiveness. It was a choice between holding on to the past and stepping into a future that had yet to be written. And as I closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch clicking into place seemed to echo with the first faint notes of a new beginning, because no matter how deep the wounds of betrayal may cut, the heart has a way of finding its way back to the light. The days that followed felt like walking through a world stripped of color. Everything around me moved forward, yet I remained anchored in the past, my thoughts tethered to the moments that had led me here. The weight of Emily's betrayal pressed against my chest with a heaviness that refused to fade, each breath a reminder of the trust that had been shattered beyond repair. Yet, beneath the sorrow and anger, a new awareness began to take root, a quiet certainty that the time for questions had passed. What remained now was the choice that would define the rest of my life. I moved through the house with a sense of detachment, my gaze lingering on the objects that had once been symbols of our shared life. The framed photos on the mantel, the books we had chosen together, the souvenirs from trips that now felt like distant echoes, all of them carried the weight of memories that no longer belonged to the life I needed to live. Each item seemed to whisper of what had been lost, yet none of them could hold me in the past. The realization settled over me with a finality that was both painful and freeing. The life I had built with Emily was over, not with a sudden break but with the slow unraveling of trust that had begun long before I discovered the truth. The decision to leave did not come all at once. It arrived in pieces, woven from the countless moments of silence that had filled the space between us since the night of the confrontation. Each glance that failed to meet mine, each unspoken word that hung heavy in the air, each brush of hands that no longer carried the warmth of connection, all of it became part of the tapestry of a choice that could no longer be postponed. The love that had once bound us together had become a memory, and no amount of hope could restore what had been broken. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the walls, I found myself standing at the threshold of our bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, the faint glow of the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway like a beacon from a world I could no longer enter. I stood there for a long moment, my breath shallow, my pulse steady beneath the weight of the decision that had crystallized within me. The ache in my chest was no longer a question of what had been lost, but a recognition of what I needed to do to reclaim the pieces of myself that had been buried beneath the weight of betrayal. Stepping into the room, I moved with deliberate purpose, each motion a silent declaration of the choice I had made. I pulled a suitcase from the closet, the faint hum of the zipper breaking the stillness as I began to pack the fragments of my life. Clothes, books, photographs, each item placed carefully, as if the act of packing could somehow contain the emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. Yet, with each item I placed inside, the weight on my chest seemed to lighten, as if the act of leaving was already beginning to free me from the shadows that had clung to me for so long. The hardest part was the framed photograph that sat on the nightstand, the image of Emily and me on the day we had moved into this house, our smiles wide with the promise of a future we had believed unbreakable. I held the frame for a long moment, my fingers tracing the edges as if I could somehow touch the memories captured within. But the past could not hold me any longer. With a steady breath, I set the frame aside, leaving it behind as a testament to what had been and what could no longer be. By the time I zipped the suitcase shut, the room around me seemed to echo with the finality of my choice. The walls that had once enclosed a life built on love and trust now stood silent, witnesses to the distance that had grown between us. Yet, as I stood there, the ache in my chest began to shift, replaced by a sense of clarity that I had not felt in weeks. The decision to leave was no longer a question of what I was losing, but a recognition of what I needed to gain: the freedom to move forward, unburdened by the weight of a love that could no longer sustain me. The sound of Emily's car pulling into the driveway echoed through the stillness of the house, a distant rumble that sent a pulse of adrenaline through my veins. I stood motionless for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound of the front door opening reached my ears. Footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor, each step a countdown to the final moment of our shared life. As she entered the room, her gaze fell on the suitcase beside me, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and something else, something that might have been regret. though it came too late to change what had already been set into motion. For a moment, the air between us seemed to freeze, heavy with the weight of all the words we had left unsaid. I met her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even me, the storm of emotions that had raged within me now tempered by the clarity of my choice. There was no need for anger, no space for blame. The time for accusations had passed. What remained was the understanding that our paths had diverged, and no amount of longing could bridge the distance that now separated us. The suitcase felt lighter as I lifted it from the floor, the weight of my decision no longer a burden but a release. As I moved toward the door, I paused for a moment, my gaze lingering on the woman who had once been my world. The sorrow in her eyes mirrored my own, yet it could not change the path that had led us here. Stepping past her, I moved through the house with measured steps, each footfall a silent farewell to the life I was leaving behind. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now stood silent, witnesses to the final moments of a chapter that had come to an end. As I crossed the threshold and stepped into the cool night air, the weight on my chest seemed to lift, replaced by the first faint stirrings of something I had not felt in a long time. Hope. The world outside stretched before me, vast and uncertain, yet filled with the promise of new beginnings. The distant hum of traffic, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant glow of city lights, all of it seemed to whisper of a future yet to be written. And as I stood there, suitcase in hand, I took my first breath of freedom, the air sharp and clean against my lungs, because in the end, the choice to leave was not a surrender to loss, but an embrace of possibility. The road ahead might be uncertain, but it was mine to walk free from the shadows of betrayal, free to rebuild a life defined not by what had been taken, but by what I would create anew. And with that thought, I stepped forward into the night, leaving the past behind. With each step I took toward the future that awaited beyond the horizon. The night air was cool against my skin as I stepped outside, suitcase in hand. The distant hum of traffic and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze seemed to echo the steady beat of my heart, calm, resolute, unburdened by the weight I had carried for too long. The house behind me stood silent, its walls holding the echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. I paused at the edge of the driveway, my breath visible in the chill of the night, and allowed myself one final glance back at the place I had once called home. The windows reflected the soft glow of the streetlights, their panes dark and still. Somewhere inside, Emily remained, perhaps standing in the same silence that now stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. Yet, no part of me ached to return. The love we had shared, the dreams we had woven together, all of it had dissolved beneath the weight of her choices. And now, as I stood on the threshold of a new beginning, I felt not sorrow, but a profound sense of release. The decision to leave had not come easily. For weeks, I had grappled with the question of whether the life we had built could still be salvaged. I had searched for answers in the echoes of our laughter, in the memories of late-night conversations and whispered promises. But no matter how far back I looked, I could not rewrite the moments that had led us here. The trust that had once been the foundation of our marriage had crumbled beneath the weight of her betrayal, and no amount of hope could rebuild what had been lost. That I and the days leading up to this moment, I had packed my belongings with a sense of purpose that felt both foreign and inevitable. Each item placed into the suitcase had carried with it a fragment of the life I was leaving behind: the clothes we had chosen together, the books whose pages we had shared, the photographs that had once captured a future filled with promise. Yet, as I packed each item, the weight on my chest seemed to lift, as if the act of leaving was already beginning to free me from the shadows of the past. The final moment had come without ceremony. There had been no final confrontation, no exchange of accusations or pleas for forgiveness. Instead, there had been only silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words, heavy with the knowledge that some wounds are too deep to heal. As I stood at the doorway, suitcase in hand, Emily had watched me with eyes that held a mixture of sorrow and understanding. For a moment, our gazes had met across the distance that now separated us, and in that moment, I saw the reflection of the life we had lost. But there had been no turning back, no second-guessing the choice I had made. Now, standing at the edge of the driveway, I took a deep breath and let the air fill my lungs, sharp and clean against the ache that still lingered in my chest. The world around me seemed to stretch out in all directions, vast and open, filled with the possibility of what lay beyond the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, uncharted, but it was mine to walk, free from the shadows of betrayal, free to rebuild a life defined not by what had been taken, but by what I would create anew. As I took my first step forward, the sound of my footsteps against the pavement seemed to echo with the finality of my choice. Each step carried me further from the past, the distance between me and the house growing with every breath. Yet, with each step, the weight on my shoulders seemed to lessen, as if the act of moving forward was already beginning to heal the wounds that had bound me to the life I was leaving behind. The distant headlights of an approaching car illuminated the road ahead, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement. As the car slowed beside me, its engine a low hum in the stillness of the night, I paused and looked toward the horizon. The faintest hints of dawn were beginning to touch the sky, casting a pale glow that seemed to promise the first light of a new day. I placed my suitcase in the trunk, the soft click of the latch closing like the final note of a long-forgotten melody. As I slid into the passenger seat, the door closing with a quiet thud, I felt the last remnants of the past begin to slip away. The car pulled away from the curb, its tires whispering against the asphalt as the house faded into the distance, its silhouette growing smaller until it disappeared from view. I watched the road stretch out before me, the world beyond the windshield unfolding with each passing mile. The ache in my chest had not vanished, but it no longer felt like a weight that would hold me back. Instead, it had become a reminder, a testament to the strength it had taken to leave behind what no longer served me. And as the city lights began to fade into the distance, replaced by the endless expanse of open road, I allowed myself to breathe, to truly breathe for the first time in what felt like forever, because in the end, the hardest part of any goodbye is not the leaving itself, but the courage it takes to step into the unknown. And as the horizon stretched out before me, bathed in the first light of a new dawn, I knew that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that I would write on my own terms, with a heart that had learned to heal and a spirit that had found the strength to let go. And with that thought, I turned my gaze forward and let the road carry me into the future that awaited beyond the horizon.